U.S. History 1, back again. Sorry I didn't post anything, finish this up. Sorry for keep saying sorry, but I threw my back out yesterday and I was kind of bedridden all day. So I'm going to try and feverishly catch up today. And I'll also post some videos tomorrow. Today's Friday, by the way. All right, looking at the Low Country. So we finished off the Middle Colonies, by far the most diverse colonies in terms of the population. Also, kind of the Goldilocks zone in terms of geography. For the most part, really the Middle Colonies are going to replicate the kind of village and farming life in the countryside that the European settlers bring from the countries the European settlers are coming from. So little German villages, little Welsh villages, little English villages, Scotch, Irish living in the back country. All right, so looking at the Low Country, so what becomes North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Originally, it's just the Carolinas. As early as the 1620s, 1629, King Charles I had been interested in promoting settlement in the Carolinas. In fact, that's where the name originally starts. However, it goes back even further. 1513, it was claimed by Spain as part of Florida. But it's not going to be really until 1663 that England is able to really promote or look to colonizing this area. And the first colonists don't arrive until 1669. So the charter was granted in 1663. So remember, 1630s through the 1650s, England is really focusing increasingly on stuff back home. So 1663 is when Charles II grants the charter, but it's not until 1669 that Lord Ashley Cooper is able to move settlers into the Carolinas at Charlestown, naming it after King Charles, right? Again, the English aren't terribly creative in naming some of these colonies, right? New England, as opposed to Old England. The Middle Colonies, because they're in between the Chesapeake and New England. New York, New Jersey, not terribly creative. New Kimru was what William Penn wanted to call Pennsylvania. It's really Charles the second that pushes for it to be called Charleston. So this is going on then about the same time then, or at the same time, as this the English seize New Netherlands and New Amsterdam from the Dutch, begin the process of colonizing the Middle Colonies. But again, it's not going to be until much later, where's my notes here? Until 1681. Yeah, I thought it was 1681. I just wanted to make sure. With Pennsylvania, that the Middle Colonies see a lot of colonization. So who goes to the Low Countries? Unlike the other colonies, the first colonists in the Low Countries are not going to be from Europe. Of course, African slaves are from Africa, not from Europe, and they make up a significant portion of the population in the Chesapeake, about 40% of the population. But aside from African slaves, the majority of settlers in the other colonies then had been from Europe. These are people of English ancestry, but they're from Barbados. England's sugar colony in what's now the Virgin Islands. So the English, following the lead of the Spanish, started establish their own sugar colonies in the Virgin Islands and Barbados, and kind of like in the Chesapeake. Initially, they relied on indentured servants to work on the sugar plantations in Barbados, particularly in the 1650s, under the rule of Oliver Cromwell. Thousands of Irish political prisoners were sentenced to indentured servitude and sent to Barbados. Like indentured servants in Virginia, those indentured servants in Barbados largely die before their sentence is up. So they get worked to death. Even a much higher percentage of the Irish indentured servants in Barbados die than those in Virginia. Keep in mind, over half of the indentured servants in Virginia in the 1620s and 1630s die before they finish their contract. I can't remember offhand, but it's around somewhere between, I think, over 70%, 70-80% of the Irish indentured servants in Barbados die before they finish their contract. As in the Chesapeake, though, in Virginia, those who survive, though, pose a problem for the sugar planters. What do you do with this not large, but this small free Irish population? Remember, the English detested the Irish. They saw them as savage barbarians, and to make it worse from the English point of view, they're Catholic. And the English nationalism and Protestantism are linked closely together, so that long-standing English bias against the Irish only gets worse in the 1600s with the religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. That's the main reason why Lord Oliver Cromwell sent so many Irish as indentured servants to Barbados, is because he detested the Irish and he hated Catholics, and he saw sending Irish to Barbados to be worked to death on sugar plantations as a way to deal with the Irish problem or question. So Barbados. So eventually they're going to, like the Chesapeake, increasingly in the 1650s, or by the 1660s, had turned to African slave labor to replace indentured servants. So by the 1660s, Barbados had adopted slave laws similar to those in Virginia, and slavery in Barbados became synonymous with black skin. So the first colonists that, so I'm going to put a little crossed swords here, because as early as 1629, when Charles I started looking at the Carolinas to settle, they were interested in, from the government's point of view, military, strategic. They wanted to protect the Chesapeake. By 1619, tobacco was making England a fortune coming from the Chesapeake. Because this territory was claimed by the Spanish as part of Florida, the English government wanted to seize this from Spain to serve as a buffer against the Spanish from Florida. They were worried that Spain could use Spanish Florida as a launching point for an invasion of Virginia, which at that point was England's most successful and wealthiest colony, tobacco. So that's the English government's point of view. Lord Ashley Cooper, though, recruits amongst Barbados sugar planters to send their younger sons, right? So Junior, Don Jr. will stay in Barbados, but Eric will go to the Carolinas with a large number of African slaves to grow rice. Looking at geography, like the Chesapeake, swampy coastline, navigable rivers. The north is more hilly than the south, and that's going to really be one of the things that leads to the division of North and South Carolina, because these people are going to end up settling largely in the southern part of the Carolinas, or Carolina, in this coastal area, broad coastal plain. Okay, so in the south, they've got a broad coastal plain moving in from the swampy coastline with very good farmland and navigable rivers. Remember, navigable rivers are really crucial to developing a agricultural economy in many of these colonies, because how do you ship your stuff to market? How do you ship your stuff back to England, your tobacco? You need rivers. Rivers are like the highways of the early modern period. It's really not going to be until the 20th century that roads become the main transportation network that we see today. That well into the 20th century, even today, rivers provide a crucial infrastructure for transportation. So if colonists are going to succeed economically as farmers, particularly on large plantations, they need lots of navigable rivers and streams to spread out into the interior. So these wealthy plantation owners settle in the coastal region in the south and largely growing rice, but also indigo and hemp. Rice, indigo, and hemp. Rice. Europeans didn't eat rice at this time. They thought rice was only fit for animal consumption. But since they viewed slaves as animals, the rice that they grow in the Carolinas are going to go back to the Barbados to feed the slave population in England's sugar colonies. So the younger sons of wealthy sugar planters go to the Carolinas to establish rice plantations to provide rice for daddy's slaves back in Barbados. In many respects then, the early colonization of Carolinas is going to be more of a colony of Barbados than it is a colony of England. So African slaves then far outnumber English colonists well into the 19th century. From the Revolution up through the Civil War, over 70% of the population of South Carolina are going to be slaves. And this is going to have a huge impact on the social and political order in South Carolina. All right. So initially, even before, actually, excuse me, 1670 was when they did Charlestown. Ashley Cooper got permission to establish Charlestown in 1669, but Charlestown's actually settled in 1670. 1663, when they get this initial charter, these Lords Proprietors, they draft a constitution for the Carolinas, which is heavily or somewhat influenced by John Locke's idea. However, there's some areas where it departs from Locke. It's a much more aristocratic constitution than later the English Bill of Rights that John Locke writes in 1688. So this is going to be 20 years before the Glorious Revolution in England, which is also borrows heavily from Locke's ideas. But it has, they have the right to a colonial assembly, but they have high property requirements for voting and participating, much like in the Chesapeake. And unlike any of the other colonies, the Constitution that they draft for the Carolinas explicitly recognizes race-based slavery. So that's going to be in the Constitution. All right. The division between North and South, that's going to happen when the descendants of Scotch-Irish, and some just straight off the boat Scotch-Irish, English, and a few Scottish Highlanders who were forcibly removed to America as punishment for the Jacobite rebellions, they start moving from Virginia into what becomes North Carolina. They tend to be poor. Subsistence farmers from the backcountry, not wealthy slave owners from Barbados. And North Carolina's hillier or more mountainous. So they're going to grow tobacco, but typically on kind of small farms. They're not going to have, at least early on, nearly as many wealthy slave owners as in South Carolina. It's going to be much more small farmers, small subsistence farmers, and with some tobacco that they raise to sell, to get money to buy stuff that they can't grow themselves. So this is why North and South Carolina ultimately split, is because kind of politically and economically, they developed very differently by the early 1700s. The formal split was in 1710. So the first Scotch-Irish start immigrating into Pennsylvania and Virginia in the 1690s. By 1710, enough of them had migrated into North Carolina, particularly the upper areas. North Carolina is kind of divided into the coastal region where English and Scottish settlers and the Piedmont, the high country, where the Scotch-Irish settle. Andrew Jackson, we'll talk about him later. His family, Scotch-Irish, originally the Jackson clan was from northern England. They're an example of these border raiders from northern England along the Scottish-English border, who were forcibly relocated to Ireland in the 1650s. And the Jackson clan immigrated to North Carolina in the 1760s, just prior to the American Revolution. And Andrew Jackson is going to be born in North Carolina, in what is now Tennessee. He's actually was born west of the Appalachians. So many of these Scotch-Irish live in the Appalachian Mountains, and many of them are going to be the first ones to cross the Appalachians into what's now Tennessee and Kentucky, and also western Pennsylvania, further north, and West Virginia. So a lot of the kind of Appalachian region, or I should say most of the people who settle in the Appalachian region are going to be of Scotch-Irish ancestry. And that has a big impact on Appalachian culture today. People in the North often think of the South as one large homogeneous Southern culture. But if you spend time traveling throughout the South, there's some big cultural differences within the South. So the high country, the Piedmont, the Appalachians, form a distinct Southern culture from the coastal regions of the Southern colonies. And there's a difference in accent and different in culture. And if you think about Appalachian culture, very clannish, a lot of the language borrows from the Scottish border region. Holler, referring to valleys as hollows or holler, that originates with the Scottish border region. Clan feuds like the Hatfields and McCoys. The Hatfields, English, Scotch-Irish, whereas the McCoys are Scottish, Scotch-Irish. The Scotch-Irish culture then has a big impact on Appalachia. North Carolina is going to have a much bigger impact by this group than South Carolina. All right. I need to... This has an impact in the Revolution as well. The coastal communities of the Carolinas had a much stronger loyalty to the English government. The loyalists in the Carolinas and Georgia tend to be in the coastal region, whereas those who support the Patriot cause tend to be the Scotch-Irish from the Highlands. Ironically, Scottish Highlanders in North Carolina, particularly in the Cape Fear area, even though they'd been forcibly relocated to North Carolina as punishment for their support of the Jacobite Rebellion in 1718, a Scottish rebellion to gain independence from England. They were actually loyalists during the Revolution. You would think that they would support the Patriot cause because their fathers and grandfathers had been sent to North Carolina as punishment for rebelling against the English government. So 60 years later, the descendants of these Scottish Highland rebels are loyal to the English government. Real irony there. So Georgia is going to be the last of the colonies. And that's going to be in 1733. James Oglethorpe. He's going to settle Georgia, named after King George. So after the Glorious Revolution, James II was deposed by Parliament in a coup. Like his grandfather, Charles I, James II had tried to raise taxes without consulting Parliament, had set up special courts to bypass Parliament's control over the court system. Judges had been appointed previously had been appointed by Parliament, not by the king. And also had appointed several Catholics as advisors. Like Charles I, James II was sympathetic to Catholics. In 1688, Parliament waited till James II was out of London, visiting one of his country estates, and they pulled off a coup, a largely bloodless coup. People do die, but it's fewer than 100. And they invite James's cousin Mary and her husband William of Orange from Holland, who are Protestants, to become the new king and queen of England to replace James II. They draft a contract, though, based on John Locke's idea of the social contract. They draw up the English Bill of Rights to limit the power of the monarchy and guarantee basic rights to all English citizens as well as Parliament. James Oglethorpe then, William and Mary then die, and their daughter Anne becomes queen, but like Elizabeth, she doesn't have any children, so she dies childless, and after Queen Anne, Parliament stuck with the question of who the next king should be. The next Stuart in line for the throne is another Charles Stuart, who had been raised a Catholic in France. So they don't want another Catholic, and they don't want another Stuart. So they invite one of his cousins from the German state of Hanover. Remember that the English had close ties with Protestants in Germany as well. George I then is going to be from Hanover, Germany, and doesn't speak any English. And he's happy to let Parliament rule and govern while he just is happy to be king. His son, George II, was also born in Germany and didn't speak any English. And it's going to be George II that George is named after. Or is it George I? Ooh, I'm going to have to check that out. Look at your English monarchs, the little link I have in course documents, the little page I have for English monarchs, and you'll be able to see really quickly if it's George I or George II that Oglethorpe names George after. So this is during the Enlightenment. Ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas of Locke and Rousseau, Voltaire. And James Oglethorpe is very much kind of a Enlightenment evangelical. He thinks this idea that you are your brother's keeper. that you have a moral responsibility to take care of those less fortunate than yourself. He's also inspired by the ideas of John Locke. And he wants to set Georgia up as an experiment to prove Locke's idea that you're not born good or evil, that you're born, that you're largely a product of your environment. That convicts and poor people, and at this time it was a crime to be a poor person. If you couldn't pay your debts, you could be sentenced to indentured servitude to pay off your debts. And in fact, in the early 1700s, there's going to be a massive increase of indentured servants sent to both the Carolinas and the middle colonies who are debt prisoners who can't pay off their debts. They're going to be sent as indentured servants. So Oglethorpe doesn't want to send indentured servants. He wants to free convicts, petty criminals, not murderers and rapists, but people who've been accused of petty crimes like theft or not being able to pay your debts, and send them to become landowners in Georgia. Like the Carolinas, the English government wants to set up Georgia for strategic reasons. By the 1730s, South Carolina is making money hand over foot. They're making a ton of money. Oh, indigo, hemp. Those are indigos for the textile industry. And by the 1690s, England was starting to industrialize and develop the textile industry. And indigo from South Carolina was a large component of the English textile industry. So the English textile industry was partly dependent on indigo from South Carolina. Hemp, that's used to make rope for the Royal Navy. And the Chesapeake and both the Chesapeake and the Low Countries produce a lot of hemp, not to smoke as marijuana, although George Washington did write that it was good for smoking pot was good for treating headaches. They grow it to make rope for ships. And this big, not only in New England, but also back in England for the Royal Navy. So the Low Countries, particularly South Carolina, are economically valuable to the English. And by the 1730s, South Carolina is the second in terms of income or wealth generated for the English government. South Carolina is the second biggest producer of revenue for the English government. Oh, also by this time, this was saw the biggest increase in population in terms of immigration, particularly North Carolina. So they wanted to defend the Carolinas from the Spanish in Florida. So why not send a bunch of criminals to be cannon fodder and defend the border? So Oglethorpe wants to send convicts to prove Locke's idea that it's your environment that shapes you, not God's will. You're not created a criminal or a poor person because God hates you. It's your environment that shapes you. If you're Oglethorpe and you're looking at all of the colonies in North America to serve as a model for Georgia, and you're motivated by this kind of Christian evangelical idea of creating good, responsible Christians out of criminals, which colony would you look at as a model for good Christian behavior? Would you look to the Carolinas with wealthy slave owners, or the Chesapeake, or New England? Yes, you'd look to New England. So initially, Oglethorpe wants Georgia to look like New England. He requires that everybody live within walking distance of a church. He prohibits owning slaves. He wants them to be hard-working farmers reliant on their own labor. He prohibits alcohol. He doesn't want them to be drunk and lazy and violent. He prohibits gambling. And he doesn't give them the right to an assembly. So who do these convicts want to be, though? They show up in Georgia, And they look at all the other colonies, and who do they want to be? Do they want to be like a bunch of Puritans in New England, or do they want to be like a bunch of rich slave owners in South Carolina who have their own colonial assembly and whose constitution allows slavery? Yes, they want to be like these dudes. Ultimately, these convicts are going to resist Oglethorpe's efforts to turn them into Puritans. They're going to get the right to create their own colonial assembly because Oglethorpe is a believer in the social contract and the ideas of Locke. He's a Whig. He believes in representative government. He's going to give in and allow these convicts to create their own colonial assembly. And the first thing that the new colonial assembly does is they legalize slavery, then they legalize alcohol, and then they legalize gambling. By the 1740s, Georgia is increasingly going to look to the Carolinas for its model of how they settle up, particularly, at least in terms of aspiration, they want to be like wealthy slave owners in the Carolinas. I think that pretty much covers the Low Country. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention on the slaves. One thing that particularly sets off South Carolina from all of the other colonies. Not only do they have the largest percentage of slaves as a total of their total population, not only does their constitution, not only do they draft a constitution even before they establish settlement, their constitution specifically allows for and defines race-based slavery. Because they rely on rice farming, that's the biggest driver of the early economy in South Carolina. Unlike the slave population in the rest of the colonies, South Carolina's slave owners are going to look to one particular region of Africa to buy most of their slaves, the Guinea coast, what's now Guinea and Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa, because those areas already had a thriving rice economy. Rice agriculture had originated in Southeast Asia, spread throughout East Asia, South Asia, into Africa, and West Africa has an ideal climate for growing rice. It's very wet, very warm, as is South Carolina. So rather than relying on slaves from all different parts of Africa, as in the Chesapeake, remember 40% of the population of Virginia were slaves, but they come from all over Africa, different languages, cultures, religions, as well as phenotype, right, facial features. And so the slave population in the Chesapeake and other colonies is very diverse, just like Africa itself. And so actually the experience of slavery is going to create a whole new ethnic identity, which we'll talk about later when we talk about slavery in more detail after the American Revolution. When we look at the antebellum economy and slavery, we'll talk about the ways in which this diverse African population is going to create a new ethnic identity in the Americas, an African-American identity that's going to fuse various parts of African culture with European American culture to form its own unique culture. But because rice farming is not nearly as labor intensive as tobacco or sugar, and it requires a special kind of skill set though, rather than enslaving a variety of Africans to work on these rice plantations, the South Carolina plantation owners are going to favor importing the so-called Gula rice farmers from the rice coast of West Africa, Guinea and Sierra Leone, and they're going to have a lot more autonomy than slaves on tobacco farms because they don't have to work as intensely to support the rice farms. So by and large, they're much more homogeneous. They're able to maintain a lot more of their African culture. And they have a lot more free time to engage in their own farming, and a little bit more autonomy, not freedom, but a little bit more autonomy than slaves in tobacco farms. All right. Indians. I didn't talk about relations with the Native Americans. In the Carolinas, particularly in the back country, as in the Shenandoah region, the colonists in the Carolinas adopt a much harsher attitude towards the Indians and take their land by force, much more than negotiating and purchasing, as we saw in the middle colonies, and to a extent early on in New England. So by the 1700s, colonists in the Low Countries are not really trying to negotiate and purchase land from the Indians. They're just taking it by force. And that's going to be another difference then between the colonial regions. All right, that finishes up the colonies. Next, I'm going to do a little lecture on what causes these guys to develop a much more shared culture.